The Big Hunger. I am blind, yet I know the road to the stars. Space is my harp, and I touch it lightly with fingers of steel. Space sings. Its music quivers in the flux patterns, comes creeping along the twitch of a positron stream, comes to whisper in glass ears. I hear. Though I am without eyes, I see the stars tangled in their field webs, tangled into one. I am the spider who runs over the web. I am the spider who spins, spinning a space where no stars are. And I am harpist to a pale, proud master. He builds me and feeds me the fuel I eat and leads me riding through the space I make to the glare of another sun. And when he is done with me, I lie rusting in the rain. My metal rots with ages, and the sea comes washing over land to take me while I sleep. The master forgets. The master chips flint from a stone, leaving a stone axe. He busies himself with drums and bloody altars. He dances with a writhing snake in his mouth, conjuring the rain. Then, after a long time, he remembers. He builds another of me, and I am the same. For like the soul of him who builds me, my principle lies beyond particular flesh. When my principle is clothed in steel, we go wandering again. I, the minstrel, with man, the king. Hear the song of his hunger, the song of his endless thirst. There was a man named Abe Jolie, and he leaned against me idly with one hand in the gloom while he spoke quietly and laughed with a female of his species. "It's finished, Junebug. We got it made," he said. And the girl looked her green eyes over me while the crickets sang beyond the wall and while the shuffling of their feet echoed faintly in the great hangar. "Finished," she murmured. "It's your success, Abe." "Mine and a lot of others. And the government's money." She toyed with the lapel of his coveralls, grinned, and said, "Let's steal it and run away." "Shh." He looked around nervously, but there were no guards in sight. "They can shoot you for less than that," he warned. "The SP doesn't have a sense of humor." "Abe." "What?" "Kiss me." He kissed her. "When is that going to be illegal too?" she whispered. He looked at her grimly, and she answered her own question. "As soon as the eugenics laws are passed, Abe. Abe Jolie, who built the space drive, a genetic undesirable." "Don't." They stood there, breathing quietly, and there was hate in their throats. "Well?" He looked around again and whispered, "Meet me here at 11 o'clock, Junebug." They parted to the sound of casual footsteps. At 11 o'clock, a lion roared in the hangar. At 11 o'clock, a steel juggernaut tore through the hangar wall and paused on a concrete ramp while bullets ricocheted off the hull. Then the first star chariot burnt a vertical column of flame in the night. Thunder walked upward on fiery stilts while men shouted angrily. When we were alone in the airless, star-stung, sun-torn blackness, I stroked the web of space and listened to the muted notes. When the tune is memorized, I speak. I contradict. I refute the universe. We lived in a spaceless space beyond stars. The man and woman had gone, but the plan remained on Earth. My principle lingered on the drawing boards and in the dreams of men who said they were sick of wars and politics and the braying of collectivist jackasses. Others were sick of petty peace and cheapness and Independence Day speeches and incorporated jackasses who blubbered disgustingly about various freedoms. They wanted the one big freedom. They built me again, these pale, proud bipeds, these children of an ape prince who walked like a god. They packed themselves in cylinders of steel and wandering, riding starward on a heart tempest that had once sung them down from the trees to stalk the plains with club and torch. The pod of earth opened, scattered its seed spaceward. It was the time of the great bursting, the great birth-giving. Empires shivered in the storm. Sky chariots flung themselves upward to vanish beyond the fringes of the atmosphere. Prairie schooners of space bore the restless, the contemptuous, the hungry, and the proud. And I led them along the self-road that runs around space. The world seethed, the empires toppled, the new empires arose whose purpose it was to build the sky chariots. Young men, young women clamored at the gates of launching fields. Those who were chosen grinned expectantly at the stars. They climbed aboard in throngs and deserted Earth. They were hard laughers with red freckles and big fists. They wore slide rules at their belts like swords, and they spoke familiarly of Schwarzschild line elements and Riemann-Christoffel tensors. Their women were restless talkers, big women with flashing white teeth. They teased the men, and their hands were strong and brown. Poets came, and misfits and saints, sinners, dirt farmers. Engineers came, and child-bearers, fighters, utopianists, and dreamers with the lights of God glowing in their starward eyes. Why were we taught to pray with downcast eyes? They asked. When you pray, look starward. Look to the God at the north end of the universe. Man was a starward wind, a mustard seed, a wisp of Brahma's breath breathed across space. They found 2 corpses in an orbit about Arcturus. The corpses were frozen, and the ice was slowly sublimating into space vapor. One of them had an engineering union card in his pocket. It gave his name as Abe Jolie. The other was a girl. And because the corpse had given them the blueprints that led to space, they hauled him aboard with the girl. Somebody sang the Kyrie, and somebody said, "I am the resurrection and the life." Then they canceled out the orbital velocity and let the corpses go toppling toward Arcturus, toward a burning sun grave where their light would shine forever. There were those who remained behind. There were those who made Earth their business and stayed at home. Their tribes were numbered at 2 billion souls, and they were somehow different from the spacers. They liked to sit in their rocking chairs. They liked prettiness and a 100-cent dollar. They voted for the Conservative Party. They abolished centralization. Eventually, they abolished government. And for the first time in anyone's memory, there was peace on Earth, goodwill among men. My master was hungry for land. My master sought new worlds, and we found them. There was a yellow sun in Serpens called 27 Lambda, lying 8 parsecs inward toward the galactic heartland and 7 parsecs north toward the galactic pole. A lush green planet drifted at 120 megamiles from the friendly sun star, and it awoke in the wandering biped nostalgic thoughts. We paused in space black, we looked, we came down on tongues of lightning from the clear sky to set jet fires in the grassy plain near a river and a forest. Man was a seed replanted. He wandered away from the sky chariot and drank from a pool in the jungle. A behemoth with several legs and a parasite rider came roaring his appetite at the pale biped, and his bones lay whitening in the sun, and his descendants learned that it was easier to stay alive by ignoring the biped from the sky. I lay rusting in the rain. Houses of log and stone grew up on the hillsides. They crumbled slowly into ruin. A man wearing a fur robe came and built an altar at my feet. He burnt his eldest daughter on it while he sang a battle song and danced of victory under strange sky. The sons of men molded clay and chipped arrowheads and built fires. The old men told them stories of a space-going god, and the stories became their legends. They kidnapped the daughters of neighbors, new wives, and multiplied. A glacier came and ground me into dust. Millenniums passed, and each prophet had his Hazar. One of the prophets wrote an energy equation. Men crucified an agitator on a telegraph pole. They purged a minority group. They split a uranium atom into atoms of strontium and xenon. They wrote immortal lines deploring war while they invented better ways to wage it. They refashioned a body for my life principle, for the tensor transformers that constitute my soul. They mounted me again in a sky-born prairie schooner because they were weary of sanctified braying. There were growling columns of blue-white fire in the night, and growling voices of restless masses of men. Men darted along the road around space. Men departed for other stars. But after 1,000 years, many remained on the planet of their birth, homebodies and movie idols and morticians, Nembutal addicts and advocates of world government. When the restless ones, the wild-eyed spacers, were gone, the addicts got religion, and the Federalists became placid anarchists, and the parliaments voted themselves out of existence. There was peace on the third planet of 27 Lambda Serpentis, and goodwill among the inhabitants thereof. They made love and studied sociology under a friendly sun, under a pleasant blue sky forever. On the road around space, my master hungered for land. And there was a yellow sun in the region of the Scorpion. And once it had been called 18 Scorpii, but now they named it Ba Lagan. It was a little south of Serpens, a little nearer to the galactic nucleus. They named its planets Albrasa and Nymphe, and they were twins. Albrasa was already populated by a clan of hairy intellectuals with teeth and twittering voices. They liked the flavor of man-flesh, digested it easily. Man came down on sky lightning. Man came down to walk on the land and own it. I lay quietly, rusting in the rain. Man taught his grandson to hammer virgin copper into a vicious battle axe and taught him the mystic recipe for roasting a hairy intellectual. It was forbidden to boil a young intellectual in the milk of its mother, but it was permissible to roast it alive and remind it that its fathers had dared to attack a two-legged god. Man's grandson waxed strong and malicious. He committed genocide on the furry natives and used their skins for blankets. He shattered their brain cases and erected his own altars in their temples. He butchered an octogenarian on one of the altars because the old man had made the silly suggestion that they sacrifice a perfectly healthy young virgin to their god. The young virgin watched the ceremony with quietly triumphant eyes. Then she married the chief priest and bore him many children. The biped bludgeoned the planet into submission. He assured himself that he was the chosen child of the Most High. He built himself a throne and sat upon it while he listened to a newscaster describe jet battles over the North Pole. Centuries wandered by, decked in gaudy robes, and there was a war with Nymphe between the worlds. And then another Abraham Jolie bent over his drawing board. Another crew of big-fisted men wrapped steel flesh around my principal. Another race of men spat contempt on the soil that had drunk the blood of their fathers, felt the fire of the suns as the rockets heaved skyward, bearing my body and the bodies of my master. Men were steel-jacketed motes of flesh scurrying among the stars. Men were as dust rolling across the galactic prairie, bits of dandelion fluff whirling in a rising tempest that bore them along the arm of the galactic spiral and inward, ever inward. Their eyes were on Hercules and the far-distant globular clusters. He paused at New Lupi and 15 Sagittaea and a nameless yellow sun in Ophiuchus, where he met a native race who dared to be bipeds. He crushed them quickly. There were always those who remained behind, lingered on the planets where their ancestors had fought. I watched them with my last eyes as the last ship hurtled into space. I watched and saw the lust go out of them, saw them become as a cauldron removed from the fire. Their boiling waned to a simmer, and they cooled. They always found peace when the spacers were gone. This I have never understood. The machine, the space spider, cannot understand. But I have seen it, the exodus of the hungry, the settling of peace over those who chose to linger. The hungry drink of the emptiness of space, and their hunger grows. The placid eat of the earth and find peace, yet somehow they seem to die a little. Ever deeper pressed the starships, deeper into Sagittarius and Scorpius and Lupus, Ophiuchus and Sagitta. Now and then they paused to colonize and conquer. A planet devoured a handful of men and tormented them with its biological devices. But the men grew and beat the savage planet into a slave after long ages, forced it to pay tribute to its king. Once more they coveted the stars. Once more they darted heavenward, leaving reluctant brothers in peace. They wrote a song. They called it 10 Parsecs to Paradise. They sang the song as if they believed it. This I have never understood. It was always 10 or 12 parsecs to another sun with a Class G spectrum, with a planet chastely clad in green forests and white clouds. There he landed to rebuild, to furrow the fertile earth, to rock in a porch swing at twilight sucking his pipe, and to thoughtfully stare at the stars while his grandchildren romped like young chimpanzees on the cool lawn. He had forgotten Earth, this old man. His race had forgotten its history. But he knew a little. He knew the star-going cycle, the landing of the starships, the regression to savagery, the painful rebuilding, the cruelty, the relearning, the proud exodus. He knew these things because man had learned to keep a little of the past intact throughout a cycle. He no longer fell back to chipping arrowheads. Now he managed to begin again in an age of bronze or soft iron, and he knew in advance that he would carve mighty industries out of savage wilderness. But the old man was sad as he sat on his porch. He knew so little of the great purpose. Why must his seed fling itself starward? He knew that it must, but he lacked a reason. His grandchildren played in the twilight, played space games, although there was not yet a starship on the planet. There was a small boy on the lawn who tried to tease the girls, but the girls put on masks of superior sophistication and ignored the little man. Disgruntled, he looked up and saw the old man dreaming on the porch. "Gramps got star craze," he shrieked. "Look at Gramp menting. Gramps got star craze." Musical laughter tittered over the lawn. Another voice took up the cry. The old man chuckled affectionately, but wistfully. They were young, but they knew about the star thirst. The planet was young, too young for starships, even though the priests preserved the records and scientific writings in the temples. The planet knew about space and coveted it. Yet the children would all be dead before the first vessel was launched. The laughter on the lawn subsided. The eldest child, a gawky and freckled girl of 8 years, came trudging up the steps to sit against the post and stare at him quietly in the gloom. He felt a question lurking in her silence. He nudged her ribs affectionately with his toe. "What weighty matter worries you, Nari?" he asked pleasantly. "Why is star craze, Gramp?" He rocked thoughtfully for a moment. "Why are there men to feel it?" he countered. The child was silent. "I know only what the priests say, Nari," he told her gently. "They say that man once owned a paradise planet, and that he ran away in search of a better one. They say he made the Lord Bion angry, and the Lord hid the paradise and condemned man to forever wander, touched his heart with eternal hunger for the place he lost. Will people find it again, Gramp?" "Never. So the priests say. The hunger is on him, Nari." "It's not fair," said the little girl. "What isn't, my child?" "Star craze. Last night I saw a lady crying. She was just standing there crying at the sky." "Where?" "On the street, waiting for a motor bus." "How old was she?" Nari scraped her heels and muttered doubtfully. "It was kind of dark." Gramp chuckled reassuringly. "I bet she wasn't over 14. I bet she was still a kid. Star craze comes to little girls about the time they start being interested in little boys. Works the other way, too." But you grow out of it, Nari. By the time you're 20, it won't make you miserable anymore. It gives you a goal, gives everyone a goal. Something to work for, something to long for and fight for. The stars. You'll want to give them to your grandchildren. Won't I get to go? Not ever, Nari. They fell silent again, and the old man peered up into the deepening blackness with its countless array of suns sitting like hens on their nests of planets. He scarcely believed the legend of the lost paradise planet, but it was a good story to tell little girls. It made him sad, though, and revived a little of the forgotten restlessness of his youth. If only he could have lived 2 centuries later. But then a gust of wind brought the sweet perfume of freshly cut hay from the field to the east of the farmhouse, and the odor made him smile. The field would have to be raked tomorrow, and the hay brought into the barn. A lot of things like that needed to be done before the starships could rise again, and every straining muscle helped toward the ultimate goal. The hay fed the animals whose flesh fed the men who made the tools, which built the factories, which fashioned more complicated tools. And so the journey down the long road to space again. The old man didn't know why the road had to be traveled, nor did he really care. The road was there, and it beckoned, and it gave meaning to life, for surely the Lord Bion was less cruel a tempter than the priests sometimes proclaimed him. Surely there was something more than despair at the end of the long, long road. The old man grew older and died peacefully, and his ashes were scattered across the fields he had tilled since boyhood. His children and his grandchildren followed in his patient steps, and their ashes were mingled with his own before the first gleaming skycraft burst starfire in the night. When the skycraft at last rumbled upward, the crowd thundered a triumphant roar. The crowd gathered to witness the culmination of their labors and the labors of their ancestors. Men walked with shoulders erect and with pride glowing in their faces. Again they triumphed over forces that held them bound to a grain of sand in the sky. Again they slashed through the knot that held them in the web of the continuum and shed the weights that dragged at their feet. I noticed the subtle difference in those who lingered behind. They no longer lingered of their own choosing. They were no longer the peace-seekers and placid ones. They were those who could not go because they were old or sick, or because the industries were half deserted and there was no one left to build the ships. They still stared longingly upward on dark nights. "We'll do it again," they promised. "We'll repopulate and do it again." But the bitterness of their plight was upon them, a sense of defeat and doom. They fought savagely among themselves. They fell in feudal wars while the starward wave receded. I am the acolyte of the space priest, the server of the pale proud biped. I have taken him onward across the void to the Hercules cluster, and beyond it to the uncharted regions past the dust clouds of the great rift, into the star-packed heartland of the galactic nucleus, where other races were testing their space wings and tasting of the great freedom. I have watched him and felt the life aura of his longing, and I have wondered, what is his goal? Where is an answer to his hunger? My neural circuits are not of flesh. My circuits are of glass and steel. My thought is a fanning electron stream. But I have prayed. I, the spider who builds around space, have prayed to the gods of the biped I serve. I have prayed to the god of the north end of space. I have asked, where is his peace? No answer came. I have seen my master change. The biped was thunder across the galaxy. The biped was a swift and steel-clad spear hurtling ruthlessly onward. He made no friends, for he came as a being who owned the stars, and he took what he wanted along the way. He left his seed to grow anew, a creature of fierce pride and fiercer longing. He trampled hatelessly such races as he encountered. He crushed them or harnessed them to his plow or borrowed their neural circuits for his biocomputers. Sometimes he fought against his own race, men who had traveled other routes to the galactic heartland. When man battled against man, they fought with hatred and cruelty and bitterness, but never with contempt. Man saw a rival king in man. Against other races he waged only cool contempt and hot death. Sometimes a thoughtful old man would say, "Seems to me they've got as much right to live as we have. Seems to me all intelligent creatures have got a common denominator. God, maybe." But he muttered it quietly, speculatively. Even if he believed it, he never objected to the swift ambush of the alien ship, nor to the razing of the alien city. For the biped stalked a new frontier. The ape tribe stole across a field where danger lurked. He was fresh from the branches of the trees, not wise to the ways of the plains. How could he risk offering peace to the shaggy beast who crouched in the tall grass? He could only weigh the odds, then strike or run away. He took the planets of the yellow suns deep in the galactic heartland. He skipped from one to the next in jumps as long as his patience would last. He captured the globular clusters. He inhabited each planet for a few generations. He built ships and battled with his brothers for the right to take them. Many were left behind. They repopulated after an exodus, rebuilt, launched a second flight, and a third, until those who finally remained at home were those who lacked the incentive of the big hunger. Those who lacked incentive sought their peace. They molded a pleasant place to live in and infested it. Or else they scorned pleasantry and made themselves a battleground. My master is the nomad, gaunt and tall. My master grits his teeth in staring at the stars, and his eyes go narrow and moist. I have mirrored this hunger, have allowed his life aura to seep into the cold steel and hot glass of me, have reflected his thoughts in my circuits. Sometimes he wonders if I am alive, but then he remembers that he built me. He built me to think, not to be alive. Perhaps I am not alive, but only a mirror that catches a little of my master's life. I have seen him change. The spearhead groups pushed relentlessly across the gleaming blackness, and each generation grew more restless than the one before it. The restless moved ahead, the contented remained at home. Each exodus was a separation and a selection of the malcontent. The biped came to believe his priests. He believed the legend of the lost home. He believed that Bion had touched him with the hunger curse. How else could they explain the pressing cry of the heart? How could they interpret the clamor of the young, the tears, except as a divine thirst, the star craze, the endless search? There was a green planet beyond the heartland, and it was ripe for bursting its human starseed. There was a launching field and a ship, and teeming crowd, and a fence with guards to keep the others out. A man and a girl stood at the fence, and it was nearly dawn. He touched her arm and gazed at the shadows on the launching site. "We won't find it, Marka," he said quietly. "We'll never find it." "You believe the legend, Terrace," she whispered. "The planet of heaven? It's up there, but we can never find it." "Then why must you look?" "We are damned, Marka." There was a silence. Then she breathed. "It can be found. The Lord Bion promised." "Where is that written, Marka?" he scoffed coldly. "In a woman's heart?" Terrace laughed loudly. "What does the heart writing say?" She turned to stare at the dark shadow of the ship against the graying sky. "It says, when man is content, without his lost paradise, when he reconciles himself, Bion will forgive and show us the road home." He waved his hand fiercely at the fading stars in the west. "Ours, Marka, they're ours. We took them." "Do you want them?" He stiffened angrily and glared at the shadow of her face. You make me sick. You're a hangbacker." "No." She shook her head wildly. "No." She caught at his arm as he retreated a step. "I wish I could go. I want to go. Do you hear?" "I hear," he snapped, "but you can't, so there's no use talking about it. You're not well, Marka. The others wouldn't let you aboard." He backed away another step. "I love you," she said frantically. He turned and stumbled away toward the sky chariot. "I love you." He began to trot, then burst into a wild sprint. Afraid, she thought in triumph, afraid of turning back, of loving her too much. "You'll never find it," she screamed after him. "You can't find it up there. It's here, right here." But he was lost in the crowd that milled about the ship. The ship had opened its hatches. The ship was devouring the people 2 at a time. The ship devoured Terrace and the space crew. Then it closed its mouth and belched flame from its rockets. She gasped and slumped against a fence post. She hung there sobbing until a guard drove her away. A rocket bellowed the space song. The girl tore off her wedding bracelet and flung it in the gutter. Then she went home to fix breakfast for the children. I am the weaver of space. I am a merchant of new fabrics in flux patterns for 5 space continua. I serve the biped who built me, though his heart be steeped in hell. Once in space, a man looked at me and murmured softly, "You are the cross on which we crucify ourselves." But the big hunger pushed him on toward the ends of space, and he encountered worlds where his ancestors had lived, and where his peaceful cousins still dwelt in symbiosis with their neighbors. Some of the worlds were civilized, some barbaric, and some were archaeological graveyards. My nomads, they wore haunted faces as they re-explored the fringes of the galaxy where man had walked before, leaving his footprints and his peace-seeking children. The galaxy was filled. Where could he go now? I have seen the frantic despair in their faces when, upon landing, natives appeared and greeted them politely, or tried to kill them, or worshipped them, or just ran away to hide. The nomads lurked near their ships. A planet with teeming cities was no place for a wanderer. They watched the multifaceted civilizations with bitter, lonely eyes. Where were new planets? Across the great emptiness to the Andromeda galaxy? Too far for the ships to go. Out to the Magellanic clouds? Already visited. Where, then? He groped blindly, this biped. He had forgotten the trail by which his ancestors had come, and he kept recrossing it, finding it winding everywhere. He could only plunge aimlessly on, and when he reached the last limit of his fuel, land. If the natives could not provide the fuel, he would have to stay and try to pass another cycle of starward growth on the already inhabited world. But a cycle was seldom completed. The nomads intermarried with the local people. The children, the hybrid children, were less steeped in hunger than their fathers. Sometimes they built ships for economic purposes, for trade and commerce, but never for the hysterical starward sweep. They heard no music from the north end of space, no Lorelei called from the void. The craving was slowly dying. They came to a planet. The natives called it Earth. They departed again in cold fright, and a space commander blew out his brains to banish the memory. Then they found another planet that called itself Earth, and another, and another. They smiled again, knowing that they would never know which was the true home of man. They sensed the nearness of the end. They no longer sang the old songs of a forgotten paradise, and there were no priests among them. They looked back at the Milky Way, and it had been their royal road. They looked ahead, where only scattered stars separated them from the intergalactic wasteland, an ocean of emptiness and death. They could not consign themselves to its ultimate embrace. They had fought too long, labored too hard to surrender willingly to extinction. But the cup of their life was broken, and to the land's last limit they came. They found a planet with a single moon, with green forests, with thin clouds draping her gold and blue body in the sunlight. The breath of the Snow King was white on her ice caps, and her seas were placid green. They landed. They smiled when the natives called the planet Earth. Lots of planets claimed the distinction of being man's birthplace. Among the natives, there was a dumpy little professor, still human though slightly evolved. On the night following the nomad's landing, he sat huddled in an easy chair, staring at the gaunt nomadic giant whose bald head nearly touched the ceiling of the professor's library. The professor slowly shook his head and sighed. "I can't understand you people." "Nor I you," rumbled the nomad. "Here is Earth, yet you won't believe it." The giant snorted contemptuously. "Who cares? Is this crumb in space the fulfillment of a dream?" "You dreamed of a lost Earth paradise." "So we thought, but who knows the real longing of a dream? Where is its end, its goal?" "We found ours here on Earth." The giant made a wry mouth. You found nothing but your own smug existence. You're a snake swallowing its tail." "Are you sure you're not the same?" purred the scholar. The giant put his fists on his hips and glowered at him. The professor whitened. "That's untrue," boomed the giant. "We've found nothing, and we're through. At least we went searching. Now we're finished." "Not you. It's the job that's finished. You can live here and be proud of a job well done." The giant frowned. "Job? What job?" "Why, fencing in the stars, populating the galaxy." The big man stared at him in horrified amazement. "Well," the scholar insisted, "you did it, you know. Who populates the galaxy now?" "People like you." The impact of the searing words brought a sick gasp from the small professor. He was a long moment in realizing their full significance. He wilted. He sank lower in the chair. The nomad's laughter suddenly rocked the room. He turned away from his victim and helped himself to a tumbler of liquor. He downed it at a gulp and grinned at the professor. He tucked the professor's liquor under his arm, waved a jaunty farewell, and lumbered out into the night. "My decanter," protested the professor in a whisper. He went to bed and lay whimpering slightly in the drowsiness. He was afraid of the tomorrows that lay ahead. The nomads settled on the planet for lack of fuel. They complained of the climate and steadfastly refused to believe that it was Earth. They were a troublesome, boisterous lot and frequently needed psychoanalysis for their various crimes. A provisional government was set up to deal with the problem. The natives had forgotten about governments, and they called it a welfare commission. The nomads who were single kidnapped native wives. Sometimes they kidnapped several, being a prolific lot. They begot many children, and a third-generation hybrid became the first dictator of a northern continent. I am rusting in the rain. I shall never serve my priest here on Earth again. Nuclear fuels are scarce. They are needed for the atomic warheads now zipping back and forth across the North Pole. A poet, one of the hybrids, has written immortal lines deploring war, and the lines were inscribed on the posthumous medal they gave his widow. 3 dumpy idealists built a spaceship, but they were caught and hung for treason. The 8-foot lawyer who defended them was also hung. The world wears a long face, and the stars twinkle invitingly, but few men look upward now. Things are probably just as bad on the next inhabited planet. I am the spider who walked around space. I, harpist for a pale, proud master, have seen the big hunger, have tasted its red glow reflected in my circuits. Still, I cannot understand. But I feel there are some who understand. I have seen the pride in their faces. They walk like kings. Conditionally human. He knew there was no use hanging around after breakfast, but he could not bear leaving her like this. He put on his coat in the kitchen, stood uncertainly in the doorway, and twisted his hat in his hands. His wife still sat at the table, fingered the handle of an empty cup, stared fixedly out the window at the kennels behind the house, and pointedly ignored his small coughings and scrapings. He watched the set of her jaw for a moment, then cleared his throat. Anne. What? I can't stand seeing you like this. Then go away. Can't I do anything? I've told you what to do. Her voice was a monotone, full of hurt. He could neither endure the hurt nor remove it. He gingerly crossed the room to stand behind her, hoping she'd look up at him and let her face go soft, maybe even cry a little. But she kept gazing out the window in accusing silence. He chuckled and suddenly touched her silk-clad shoulder. The shoulder shivered away. Her dark hair quivered as she shuddered, and her arms were suddenly locked tightly about her breasts as if she were cold. He pulled back his hand. His big, pliant face went slack. He gulped forlornly. Honeymoon's over, huh? Ha! He backed away a step and paused again. Hey, baby, you knew before you married me, he reminded her. I did not. You knew I was district inspector for the FBA. You knew I had charge of a pound. I didn't know you killed them, she snapped, whirling. I don't have to kill many, he offered. That's like saying you don't kill them very dead. Look, honey, they're only animals. Intelligent animals. Intelligent as a human imbecile, maybe. A baby is an imbecile. Would you kill a baby? Of course you would. You do. That's what they are. Babies. I hate you. He withered, groped desperately for a new approach. Look, intelligence is a word applicable only to humans. It's the name of a human function, and that makes them human, she finished. Murderer. Baby. Don't call me baby. Call them baby. He made a miserable noise in his throat, backed a few steps toward the door, and beat down his better judgment against speaking again. Anne, honey, look, think of the good things about the job. Sure, everything has its ugly angle, but just think. We get this house rent-free. I've got my own district with no local boss to hound us. I make my own hours. You'll meet lots of people that stop in at the pound. It's a fine job, honey. Her face was a mask again. She sipped her coffee and seemed to be listening. He blundered hopefully on. And what can I do about it? I can't help my placement aptitude score. They say bio authority is where I belong, and it's to bio I have to go. Oh, sure, I don't have to work where they send me. You can always join the general work pool, but that's all the law allows, and GWPers don't have families, so I go where placement aptitude says I'm needed. You've got aptitude for killing kids? He groaned and closed his eyes. They gave me the job because I like kids, and because I have a biology degree and a knack for being neighborly, maybe, with plain people, and because I'm not really brainy enough to be a scientist, just a technician. Understand? And destroying the unclaimed animals is the smallest part of it. Honey, before the Evolvotron, before anybody ever heard of Anthropos Incorporated, people used to have municipal officials for such things. Dog catchers, I think they called them. Didn't have the Dog R series then, of course, not mutants. But that's all it is. I'm just an up-to-date dog catcher. Ice-green eyes turned slowly to meet his gaze. Her face by window light seemed delicately cut from dusty marble. A corner of her mouth twitched contempt. Then she looked out of the window toward the kennels again. He backed to the door, plucked nervously at a splinter on the woodwork, watched her hopefully for a moment. Work to do. Gotta go. Do you need to be kissed? Sweetly contemptuous. He ripped the splinter loose. See you tonight. The front door slammed. She sat, listening to his footsteps on the porch and down the walk. Then the kennel truck's starter grumbled and its turbines whined to life. She choked back a sob and started after him, but by the time she got to the porch, the truck was already backed into the street. It lurched suddenly away with angry acceleration toward the highway that lay to the east. She stood blinking in the red morning sunlight, shoulders slumped. Things were wrong with the world. A bell rang somewhere, rang again. She started slightly, shook herself, went to answer the telephone. A carefully enunciated voice that sounded chubby and professional called for Inspector Norris. She told it disconsolately that he was gone. Gone? Oh, you mean to work. I thought for a moment you meant... Can this be the new Mrs. Norris? The voice was hearty, greasy. She muttered affirmatively. Yes. Norris told me. This is Dr. George's, my dear. I have a rather urgent matter to talk over with your husband, but perhaps I can talk to you. You can probably get him on the highway. There's a phone in the truck. What sort of urgent matters, she wondered, did doctors discuss with dog catchers? I'm afraid not, my dear. The inspector doesn't switch on his phone until office hours. I know him well. Can't you wait? It's really an emergency, Mrs. Norris. I need an animal from the pound, a chimp, K48-3, preferably a 5-year-old. I know nothing about the kennels, she said rather stiffly. You'll have to talk to him. Now, see here, Mrs. Norris, this is an emergency, and I have to have... Why don't you just do whatever you would have done if I hadn't answered the phone, she said, and quietly hung up. It began ringing again. She glanced back at it with twinges of guilt. Emergency? What sort of emergency would require a chimp K48? Butchery, she muttered vaguely, and let the phone ring. She was not going to get involved in his work. I'll leave him first, she told herself. The truck whirred slowly along the suburban street that wound among nestled groups of pastel plastic cottages set approximately 2 to an acre on the lightly wooded land. With its population fixed by law at 500 million, the continent was one sprawling suburb dotted with community centers between the dense belts and blots of industrial development. There was no open country, had been none since the days of his grandparents. This was relative wilderness. He liked it, but there was still no place to be alone. He approached an intersection. A small animal sat on the curb, wrapped in its own busy tail. The crown of its oversized head was bald, but its body was covered with gray-blue fur. A pink tongue licked daintily at small forepaws that were equipped with prehensile thumbs. It eyed the truck morosely as Norris drew to a halt and smiled down at it from the cab. "Hi, kitten. What's your name?" The cat, Q5, stared at him indifferently for a moment. "Kia Rory," it wailed at last. "Kitty Rory? That's a fine name. Where do you live, Rory?" The cat, Q5, ignored him. "Whose child are you, Rory? Will you tell me that?" Rory regarded him disgustedly. Norris glanced around. There were no houses near the intersection, and he feared the animal might be lost. It blinked at him, sleepily, bored, then resumed its paw bath. He repeated the question. "Mama Kiyi? Kiyi Mama?" It finally reported. "That's right, Mama's kitty. But where is Mama? Suppose she ran away? The cat Q5 looked startled. It stuttered briefly. Its fur crept erect. It glanced both ways along the street, shot suddenly away at a fast scamper along the sidewalk. Norris followed it in the truck for 2 blocks until it darted onto a porch and began wailing through the screen, "Mama no run Ray! Mama no run Ray!" He chuckled and drove on. A couple who had failed to satisfy the genetic requirements for legal childbearing could become quite attached to a cat Q5, but the cats were safer, emotionally safer than any of the quasi-human models such as the chimp K or Neutroid. The death of a Neutroid struck some families as hard as it might the death of a child. Most couples at least managed to endure the loss of a cat Q or dog F without formal mourning or quasi-religious rites. A genetic C couple were permitted to own 1 Neutroid or 2 non-anthropic models whose daily food requirements would not exceed 800 calories. Many psychologists seemed to regard Neutroids as dynamite, recommended pets with a lower love demand potential. What about Anne? Norris lost his vestigial smile. His own card was stamped Genetic C. They had agreed to a childless marriage. Anne loved kids, but he had agreed to it. He had been thinking about the kennel animals, how she might help with them, direct her maternal feelings toward them, divert her basic need. But now, the hostility. What if she wanted a pseudo-party, a Neutroid, for herself? An invitation of a pseudo-party had come in yesterday's mail. He fumbled in his pocket for the battered card. You are cordially invited to attend the pseudo-parturition and ensuing cocktail hour to celebrate the arrival of Honey Blossom. Cherished event to occur on 12 weeks 6th day of 2063 at 1930 hours. Reception room, Rockabye Hours Clinic. RSVP, Mr. and Mrs. John Hanley Slade. The invitation had come late. The party would be tonight. He had meant to call Slade today and say that he and Anne would probably drop in for cocktails but would be unable to get there in time for the delivery. But now that she had reacted so sharply to the less pleasant aspects of his job, perhaps he had better keep her away from sentimental occasions involving Neutroids. Glancing at the card again reminded him to stop at Sherman 3 Community Center for the mail. He turned onto the shopping street that paralleled the great highway and drove past several blocks of commercial buildings that served the surrounding suburbs. At the down ramp, he gave the attendant a 4-bit bill and sent the truck down to be parked under the street, then went to the message office. When he dropped his code disc into the slot, the feedway under his box number chattered out a yard of paper tape. He scanned it slowly end to end. Note from Aunt May, bill from Synthamilk Products, letter from Anne's mother. The only item of importance was the memo from the chief. A troublesome tidbit, but he had expected it. Attention all district inspectors. Subject: Deviant Neutroid. You will immediately initiate systematic and thorough survey of all animals bearing serial numbers in the Bermuda K99 series for birth dates during 26th through 32nd weeks of year 2062 in re Delmont negligency case. Seize animals in this category, impound, run applicable sections of normalcy tests, observe signs of endocrinal deviation and non-standard response patterns. Delmont confessed to passing only one non-standard model, but suspect others. He disclaims memory of deviant's serial number, possible ruse to stop investigation after first animal found, if more than one. If allowed to reach age set or adulthood, such a deviant could be dangerous to its owner or others. Hold all seized K-99s who exhibit the slightest departure from standard. Forward to Central Lab. Return standard units to owners. Accomplish within 7 days. C. Franklin. 7 days, he remarked irritably, wadded the tape in his pocket, stalked out to get the truck. The district covered 200 square miles. With a replacement quota of 75 neutroids a week, the district would probably have picked up about 40 K-99s from the Bermuda factory influx during the 6-week period last year. Could he round them all up in a week? It seemed doubtful, and there were only 11 empty cages in the kennel. The other 49 were occupied by the previous inspector's unclaimed inventory, awaiting destruction. The crematorium behind the kennels appeared slated for a busy week. Anne. He was halfway to Wilo City when the radio phone buzzed on the dash. He pulled into the slow lane and answered quickly, hoping for his wife's voice. Instead, there was a polite professional purr. "Inspector Norris?" Norris made a sour mouth. "Yes, George's. Are you extremely busy at the moment?" "What rich bitch is your problem now, Doctor?" "Now, Norris." "Busy. Extremely busy. One of my patients, a Mrs. Sarah Glubbis, called a while ago and said her baby was sick." "So?" "She has no baby. I'm getting absent-minded. I forgot she's genetic C until I got there." "Let me guess. It turned out to be a neutroid." "That's right. Why tell me?" "It's dying. 18th order virus. Naturally, I can't get it admitted to a hospital." "Ever hear of vets?" "You don't understand. She insists it's her baby, believes it's her own. How can I send it to a vet?" "That's your worry. Is she an old patient of yours?" "Why, yes, I've known Sarah since you presided at her pseudo-part." "How did you know?" "Just a guess. If you put her through pseudo-part, then you deserve all the trouble you get." "I take it you're an abolitionist." "Skip it. What did you want from me?" "A replacement neutroid. From the kennel." "Baloney. You couldn't fool her. If she's blind, she'd still know her own animal." "I'll have to take the chance. Listen, Norris, it's pathetic. She knows the disease can be cured in humans with hospitalization and expensive treatment that I can't get for a neutroid. No vet could get the drug either. Scarce. It's pathetic." "I'm crying all over the steering wheel." The doctor paused. "Sorry, Norris. I thought you were human." "Not to the extent of doing half-legal favors that won't be appreciated for some rich neurotic dame and a doc who practices pseudo-part." "One correction," Georges said stiffly. "Sarah's not rich. She's a middle-aged widow and couldn't pay for treatment if she could get it. But thanks anyway, Norris." "Hold it," he grunted. "What's the chimp series?" "It's a K-48, a 5-year-old with a 3-year age set." Norris thought for a moment. It was a dirty deal, and it wouldn't work. "I think I've got one in the kennel that's fairly close," he offered doubtfully. Good. I'll have Fred go over him. Wait, now. This one'll be spooky, won't know her, and the serial number will be different." I know, Georges sighed, "but it seems worth a try. An attack of V18 can cause mild amnesia in humans, That might explain why it won't know her. About the serial number, don't try changing it, Norris growled. How about obliterating? Don't. And I'll check on it a couple of weeks from now to make damn sure you don't. That's a felony, Georges. All right. I'll just have to take the chance that she won't notice it. When can I pick it up? Call my wife in 15 minutes. I'll speak to her first. Yes. Mrs. Norris. Very well. Thanks, Inspector. Georges hung up quickly. Norris lit a cigarette, steeled himself, called Anne. Her voice was dull, depressed, but no longer angry. All right, Terry, she said tonelessly. I'll go out to the kennel and get the one in cage 31 and give it to Georges when he comes. Thanks, babe. He heard her mutter, and then I'll go take a bath, just before the circuit clicked off. He flipped off the auto driver, took control of the truck, slipped into the fast lane and drove furiously toward Wilo City and the district wholesale offices of Anthropos Incorporated to begin tracing down the suspected Bermuda K-99s in accordance with Franklin's memo. He would have to check through all incoming model files for the 6-week period, go over the present inventory, then run down the Bermuda serial numbers in a mountain of invoices covering a 30-week period, find the pet shops and retail dealers that had taken the doubtful models, and finally survey the retail dealers to trace the models to their present owners. With cooperation from wholesaler and dealers, he might get it down to the retail level by mid-afternoon, but getting the models away from their owners would be the nasty part of the job. He was feeling pretty nasty himself, he decided. The spat with Anne, the distasteful thoughts associated with Slade's pseudo-party, the gnawing remorse about collaborating with Dr. Georges in a doubtful maneuver to pacify one Sarah Glubbis, a grim week's work ahead, plus his usual charge of suppressed resentment toward Chief Franklin, it all added up to a mood that could turn either black or vicious, depending on circumstance. If some doting mama gave him trouble about impounding her darling tailwagger, he was, he decided, in the right kind of mood to get a warrant and turn the job over to the sheriff. The gasping neutroid lay on the examining table under the glaring light. The torso quivered and twitched as muscles contracted spasmodically, but the short legs were already limp and paralyzed, allowing the chubby man in the white coat to lift them easily by the ankles and retrieve the rectal thermometer. The neutroid wheezed and chattered plaintively as the nurse drew the blanket across its small body again. 109, grunted the chubby man, his voice muffled by the gauze mask. His eyes probed the nurse's eyes for a moment. He jerked his head toward the door. She still out there? The nurse nodded. The doctor stared absently at the thermometer stem for a moment, looked up again, spoke quietly. Get a hyponecrophene. She turned toward the sterilizer, paused briefly. 3 cc's? She asked. 12, he corrected. Her eyes locked with his for several seconds. Then she nodded and went to the sterilizer. May I leave first? She asked tonelessly while filling the syringe. Certainly. What'll I say to Miss Glubbis? She crossed the table again and handed him the hypo. Nothing. Use the back way. Go tell Fred to run over to the kennels and pick up the substitute. I've called Mrs. Norris. Oh, yeah, and tell Fred to stop in here first. I'll have something for him to take out. The nurse glanced down at the squirming, whimpering newt, shivered slightly, and left the room. When the door closed, Georges bent over the table with the hypo. When the door opened again, Georges looked up to see his son looking in. "Take this along," he grunted, and handed Fred the bundle wrapped in newspapers. "What'll I do with it?" the youth asked. "Chuck it in Norris's incinerator." Fred glanced at the empty examining table and nodded indifferently. "Can Miss Laskell come back now?" he asked in going. "Tell her, yeah, and hurry with that other newt." "Sure, Pop. See you later." The nurse looked in uncertainly before entering. "Get cleaned up," he told her, "and go sit with Mrs. Glubbis." "What'll I say?" "The baby will recover. She can take it home late this afternoon if she gets some rest first." "What are you going to do about the substitute?" "Give it a shot to put it to sleep. Give her some codeine to feed it." "Why?" "So it'll be too groggy for a few days to even notice her, so it'll get addicted and attached to her because she gives it the codeine." "The serial number?" "I'll put the tattooed foot in a cast. V18 paralysis, you know." "Smart," she muttered, but there was no approval in her voice. When she had changed clothes in the anteroom, she unlocked the door to the office, but paused before passing on into the reception room. The door was ajar, and she gazed through the crack at the woman who sat on the sofa. Sarah Glubbis was gray and gaunt and rigid as stone. She sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her wide, empty eyes, dull blue spots on yellowed marble orbs, staring ceilingward while the colorless lips of a knife-slash mouth moved tautly in earnest prayer. The nurse's throat felt tight. She rubbed it for a moment. After all, the thing was only an animal. She straightened her shoulders, put on a cheerful smile, and marched on into the reception room. The yellowed orbs snapped demandingly toward her. "Everything's all right, Mrs. Glubbis," she began. Finished. Norris grunted at 3 o'clock that afternoon. 36 K99s, murmured the Anthropos file clerk, gazing over Norris's shoulder at the clipboard with the list of doubtful newts and the dealers to whom they had been sent. "Lots of owners may be hard to locate." "Yeah, thanks, Andy. And you too, Mabel." The girl smiled and handed him a slip of paper. "Here's a list of owners for 13 of them. I called the 2 local shops for you. Most of them live here close." He glanced at the names, felt tension gathering in his stomach. It wasn't going to be easy. What could he say to them? "Howdy, ma'am. Excuse me, but I've come to take your little boy away to jail." "Oh, yes, ma'am. He'll have a place to stay, in a little steel cage with a fork full of straw, and he'll get vitaminized mush every day." "What's that? His sleepy time stories and his pink honey crumbles?" "Sorry, ma'am, your little boy is only a mutated chimpanzee, you know, and not really human at all." "That'll go over great," he grumbled, staring absently at the window. "Beg pardon, sir?" answered the clerk. "Nothing, Andy, nothing." He thanked them again and strode out into the late afternoon sunlight. Still a couple of hours working time left and plenty of things to do. Checking with the other retail dealers would be the least unpleasant task, but there was no use saving the worst until last. He glanced at the list Maybelle had given him, checked it for the nearest address, then squared his shoulders and headed for the kennel truck. Anne met him at the door when he came home at 6. He stood on the porch for a moment, smiling at her weakly. The smile was not returned. "Dr. Georges's boy came," she told him. He signed for the... She stopped to stare at him, then opened the screen, reached up quickly to brush light fingertips over his cheek. Terry, those welts, what happened? Get scratched by a cat cue? No, by a human F, he grumbled, and stepped past her into the hall. Anne followed, eyeing him curiously while he reached for the phone and dialed. Who are you calling? She asked. Society's watchdog, he answered as the receiver buzzed in his ear. Your eye, Terry, it's all puffy. Will it turn black? Maybe. Did the human F do that too? Human M, name of Pete Klusky. The phone cracked at him suddenly. This is the record voice of Sheriff Yates. I'll be out from 5 to 7. If it's urgent, call your constable. He hung up briefly, then irritably dialed the locator service. Mnemonic register, trail calls, and official locations, grated a mechanical voice. Your business, please? This is T. Norris, Sherman 9-4566-78B, official rating B, priority B, code XT88U-BIO. Get Sheriff Yates for me. Nature of the call? A fish biz. I shall record the call. He waited. The robot found Yates on the first probability trial attempt in the local pool hall. I'm getting to hate that infernal gadget, Yates snapped. Acts like it's got me psyched. What do you want, Norris? Cooperation. I'm mailing you 3 letters charging 3 Wilo citizens with resisting a federal official, namely me, and charging one of them with assault. I tried to pick up their neutroids for a pound inspection, and... Yates bellowed lusty laughter in his ear. Not funny, he growled. I've got to get those neutroids. It's connected with the Delmont case. Yates stopped laughing. Oh, well, I'll take care of it. Rush order, Sheriff. Can you get the warrants tonight and pick up the animals in the morning? Easy on those warrants, boy. Judge Charlman can't be bothered just any time. I can get the newts to you by noon, I guess, provided we don't have to get a helicopter posse to chase down the mothers. Well, okay. But listen, I want the charges dropped if they cooperate with you. And don't shake the warrants at them unless you have to. Just get those newts. That's all I want. Okay, boy. Give me the dope. Norris read him the names and addresses of the 3 unwilling owners and a precise account of what happened in each case. As soon as he hung up, Anne muttered, Sit still, perched on his knees and began stroking chilly ointment across his burning cheek. He watched her cool eyes flicker from his cheek to his own eyes and down again. She was no longer angry, but only gloomy and withdrawn from him. He touched her arm. She seemed not to notice it. Hard day, Terry? Slightly. I picked up 9 newts out of 13, anyhow. They're in the truck now. Good thing you didn't get them all. There are only 12 empty cages. 12? Oh, George's picked one up, didn't he? And sent a package, she said, eyeing him soberly. Package? Where is it? In the crematorium. The boy took it back there. He swallowed a tight spot in his throat, said nothing. Oh, and darling, Mrs. Slade called. Why didn't you tell me you were going out tonight? Going out? It sounded a little weak. Well, she said she hadn't heard from you. I couldn't very well say no, so I told her I'd be there, at least. You? Oh, I didn't say about you, Terry. I said you'd like to go, but you might have to work. I'll go alone if you don't want to. He stared at her with a puzzled frown. You want to go to the pseudo-party? Not particularly, but I've never been to one. I'm just curious. He nodded slowly, felt grim inside. She finished with the ointment, patted his cheek, managed a cheerful smile. Come on, Terry. Let's go unload your 9 neutroids. He stared at her, dumbly. Let's forget about this morning, Terry. He nodded. She averted her face suddenly, and her lip quivered. I know you've got a job. That's got to be... She swallowed hard and turned away. See you out in the kennels, she choked gaily, then hurried down the hall toward the door. Norris scratched his chin unhappily as he watched her go. After a moment, he dialed the mnemonic register again. Keep a line on this number, he ordered after identifying himself. If Yates or Franklin calls, ring continuously until I can get in to answer. Otherwise, just memorize the call. Instructions acknowledged, answered the circuitry. He went out to the kennels to help Anne unload the neutroids. A sprawling concrete barn housed the cages, and the barn was sectioned into 3 large rooms, one housing the fragile, humanoid, chimpanzee mutants, and another for the lesser breeds, such as cat cues, dog Fs, dwarf bears, and foot-high lambs that never matured into sheep. The 3rd room contained a small gas chamber, with a conveyor belt leading from it to the crematorium. He usually kept the 3rd room locked, but he noticed in passing that it was open. Evidently, Anne had found the keys in order to let Fred Georges dump his package. A Noah's Ark chorus greeted him as he passed through the animal room, to be replaced by the mindless chatter of the doll-like neutroids as soon as he entered the air-conditioned neutroid section. Dozens of blazing blonde heads began dancing about their cages, their bodies thwacked against the wire mesh as they leaped about their compartments with monkey grace in recognition of their feeder and keeper. Their human appearance was broken only by 2 distinct features: short, beaver-like tails decorated with fluffy curls of fur, and an erect thatch of scalp hair that grew up into a bright candle flame. Otherwise, they appeared completely human, with baby-pink skin, quick little smiles, and cherubic faces. They were sexually neuter and never grew beyond a predetermined age set which varied for each series. Age sets were available from 1 to 10 years, human equivalent. Once a neutroid reached its age set, it remained at this stage of retarded development until death. They must be getting to know you pretty well, Anne said as she came from behind a section of cages. A big, loud welcome for Papa, huh? He frowned slightly as he glanced around the gloomy room and sniffed the animal odors. That's funny. They don't usually get this excited. She grinned. Big confession. It started when I came in. He shot her a quick, suspicious glance, then walked slowly among a row of cages, peering inside. He stopped suddenly beside a 3-year-old K-76 to stare. Apple cores? He turned slowly to face his wife, trying to swallow a sudden spurt of anger. Well? He demanded. Anne reddened. I felt sorry for them eating that goo from the mechanical feeders, so I drove down to Sherman 3 and bought 6 dozen cooking apples. That was a mistake. She frowned irritably. We can afford it. That's not the point. There's a reason for mechanical feedings. Oh? What is it? He hesitated, knowing she wouldn't like the answer, but she was already stiffening. Let me guess, she said coldly. If you feed them yourself, they get to love you, right? Yeah. They even attach some affection to me because they know that right after I come in, the feeders get turned on. I see, and if they love you, you might get queasy about running them through room 3's line, eh? That's about the size of it, he admitted. Okay, Terry, I feed them apples, you run your production line, she announced firmly. I can't see anything contradictory about that, can you? Her eyes told him that he had damn well better see something contradictory about it, whether he admitted it or not. Planning to get real chummy with them, are you? He inquired stiffly. Planning to dispose of any soon? She countered. Honeymoon's off again, eh? She shook her head slowly, came toward him a little. I hope not, Terry. I hope not. She stopped again. They watched each other doubtfully amid the chatter of the neutroids. After a time, he turned and walked to the truck, pulled out the snare pole, and began fishing for the squealing, squeaking doll things that bounded about like frightened monkeys in the truck's wire mesh cage. They were one-family pets, always frightened of strangers, and these in the truck remembered him only as the villain who had dragged them away from Mama into a terrifying world of whirling scenery and roaring traffic. They worked for a time without talking. Then Anne asked casually, What's the Delmont case, Terry? Huh? What makes you ask? I heard you mention it on the phone. Anything to do with a black eye and a scratched face? He nodded sourly. Indirectly. It's a long story. Well, you know about the Evolvotron. Only that Anthropos Incorporated uses it to induce mutation. It's a sort of subatomic surgical instrument for doing plastic surgery to reproductive cells. Here, grab this chimp. Get him by the leg. Oops. Got him. Go ahead, Terry. Using an Evolvotron on the gene structure of an ovum is like playing microscopic billiards, with protons and deuterons and alpha particles for cue balls. The operator takes the living ovum, mounts it in the device, gets a tremendously magnified image of it with the slow neutrino shadowscope, compares the image with a gene map, starts gouging out submolecular tidbits with single particle shots. He juggles them around, hammers chunks in where nothing was before, plugs up gaps, makes new gaps. Catch? She looked thoughtful, nodded. Catch. And the Lord Man made neutroid from the slime of an ape, she murmured. Huh? Here, catch this critter. Snare's choking him. Okay, come to Mama. Well, go on. Tell me about Delmont. Delmont was a green Evolvotron operator. Takes years of training, months of practice. Practice? It's an art more than a science. Speed's the thing. You've got to perform the whole operation from start to finish in a few seconds. Ovum dies if you take too long. About Delmont? Got through training and practice tryouts, okay? Good rating, in fact. But he was just one of those people that blow up when rehearsals stop and the act begins. He spoiled over 100 ova the first week. That's to be expected. 1 success out of 10 tries is a good average. But he didn't get any successes. Why didn't they fire him? Threatened to. Guess he got hysterical. Anyhow, he reported 1 success the next day. It was faked. The ovum had a couple of flaws, something wrong in the nervous system's determinants, and in the endocrinal setup. Not a standard neutroid ovum. He passed it on to the incubators to get a credit, knowing it wouldn't be caught until after birth. It wasn't caught at all? Huh. He was afraid it might not be caught, so he suppressed the testosterone flow to its incubator so that it would be, later on. Why that? All the neutroids are potential females, but male hormone is pumped to the fetus as it develops, keeps female sexuality from developing, results in a neuter. He decided that the inspectors would surely catch a female, and that would be blamed on a malfunction of the incubator, not on him. So, Norris shrugged. So, inspectors are human, so maybe a guy came on the job with a hangover and missed a trick or two. Besides, they all look female. Anyhow, she didn't get caught. How did they ever find out Delmont did it? He got caught last month, trying it again, confessed to doing it once before. No telling how many times he really did it. Norris held up the final kicking, squealing, tassel-haired doll from the back of the kennel truck. He grinned down at Anne. Now, take this little yeep, for instance. Might be a potential she. Might also be a potential murderer. All these kiddos from the truck came from the machines in the section where Delmont worked last year when he passed that fake. Can't have non-standard models on the loose. Can't have sexed models either. Then they'd breed and get out of hand. The Evolvotron could be shut down any time it became necessary, and when that generation of mutants died off, he shrugged. Anne caught the struggling baby creature in her arms. It struggled and tried to bite, but subsided a little when she disentangled it from the snare. Cree, it cooed nervously. Cree, cree. You tell him you're no murderer, she purred to it. He watched disapprovingly while she fondled it. One code he had accepted: steer clear of emotional attachment. It was 8 months old and looked like a child of 2 years, a year short of its age set, and it was designed to be as affectionate as a human child. Put it in the cage, Anne, he said quietly. She looked up and shook her head. It belongs to somebody else. Suppose it transfers its fixation to you. You'd be robbing its owners. They can't love many people at once. She snorted, but installed the thing in its cage. Anne? Norris hesitated, knowing that it was a bad time to approach the subject, but thinking about Slade's pseudo-party tonight and wondering why she had accepted. What, Terry? He leaned on the snare pole and watched her. Do you want one of them for yourself? I can sign an unclaimed one over to you. Wouldn't cost anything. She stared at him evenly for a moment, glanced down at her feet, paced slowly to the window to stand hugging her arms and looking out into the twilight. With a pseudo-party, Terry? He swallowed a lump of anxiety and found his voice. Whatever you want. I hear the phone ringing in the house. He waited. It stopped, she said after a moment. Well, babe? Whatever I want, Terry? She turned slowly to lean back against a patch of gray light and look at him. He nodded. Whatever you want. I want your child. He stiffened with hurt, stared at her open-mouthed. I want your child. He thrust his hand slowly in his hip pocket. Oh, don't reach for your Social Security card. I don't care if it's got genetic Z on it. I want your child. Uncle Federal says no, babe. To hell with Uncle Federal. They can't send a human through your room 3. Not yet, anyhow. If it's born, the world's stuck with it. And the parents are forcibly separated, reduced to common labor status, remember? She stamped her foot and whirled to the window again. Damn the whole hellish world, she snarled. Norris sighed heavily. He was sorry she felt that way. She was probably right in feeling that way, but he was still sorry. Righteous anger, frustrated, was no less searing a psychic acid than the unrighteous sort, nor did a stomach pause to weigh the moral worth of the wrath that drenched it before giving birth to an ulcer. Hey, babe, if we're going to the Slade affair... She nodded, grimly, and turned to walk with him toward the house. At least it was better having her direct her anger at the world rather than at him, he thought. The expectant mother played 3 games of badminton before sundown, then went inside to shower and dress before the guests arrived. Her face was wreathed in a merry smile as she trotted downstairs in a fresh smock, her neck still pink from the hot water, her wake fragrant with faint perfume. There was no apparent need for the smock, nor was there any pregnant caution in the way she threw her arm around John's neck and kicked up her heels behind her. "Darling," she chirped, "there'll be plenty of milk. I never believed in bottle feeding. Isn't it wonderful?" "Great. The injections are working, I guess." She looked around. "It's a lovely resort hotel. I'm glad you didn't pick Angel's Haven." "So am I," he grunted. "We'll have the reception room all to ourselves tonight." "What time is it?" 7:10. "Oh, the doc called to say he'd be a few minutes late. He was busy all day with a sick baby." She licked her lips and glanced aside uneasily. "Class A couple?" "No, doll. Class C, and a widow." "Oh." She brightened and watched his face teasingly. "Will you pace and chain smoke while I'm in delivery?" He snorted amusement. "Hey, it's not as if you were really—" He stopped amid a fit of coughing. "Not as if I were really what?" "Now look, I didn't mean—" "Not as if I were really what?" she demanded, eyes beginning to brim. "Listen, darling, I'll pace and I'll chain smoke." A nurse came clicking across the floor. "Mrs. Slade, it's time for your first injection. Dr. George's just called. Will you come with me, please?" "Not as if I what, John?" she insisted, ignoring the nurse. He lit a cigarette from the butt of the last and looked around nervously. "She'll be all right?" he asked the nurse. "Mrs. Slade, will you please?" "All right, nurse, I'm coming." She tossed her husband a hurt glance, walked away, dabbing at her eyes. "Expectant dames are always cranky," sympathized an attendant who sat on a bench nearby. "Take it easy. She won't be so touchy after it comes." John Hanley Slade shot an irritable glare at the eavesdropper, saw a friendly comedian face grinning at him, returned the grin uneasily, and went over to sit down. "You first?" John Hanley nodded, stroking nervously at his thin hair. "I see him come, I see him go. It's always the same." "What do you mean?" John grunted. "Same expressions, same worries, same attitudes, same conversation, same questions. The guy always makes some remark about how it's not really having a baby, and the dame always gets sore. Happens every time." "It's all pretty routine for you, eh?" he muttered stiffly. The attendant nodded. He watched the expectant father for several seconds, then grunted. "Go ahead, ask me." "Ask you what?" "If I think all this is silly. They always do." John stared at the attendant irritably. "Well?" "Do I think it's silly? No, I don't." "Fine, that's settled then." "Nah, I don't think it's silly. Because for a dame, it ain't satisfying if she plunks down the dough, buys a newt, and lets it go at that. There's something missing between bedroom and baby." "That's so." John's sarcastic tone was apparently lost on the man. "It's so," he announced. "Physiological change, that's what's missing. For a newt to really take the place of a baby, the mother's got to go through the whole build-up. Doc gives her injections. She craves pickles and mangoes. More injections for morning sickness. More injections, she gets chubby. And finally, shots to bring mild labor and false delivery. So then she gets the newt, and everything's right with the world. Ask me something else, the attendant offered. John looked around helplessly, spied an elderly woman near the entrance. She had just entered and stood looking around as if lost or confused. He did not recognize her, but he got up quickly. "Excuse me, chum. Probably one of my guests." Sure. I gotta get on the job anyhow." The woman turned to stare at him as he crossed the floor to meet her. Perhaps one of Mary's friends, he thought. There were at least a dozen people coming that he hadn't met, but his welcoming smile faded slightly as he approached her. She wore a shabby dress, her hair was disheveled in a gray tangle, her matchstick legs were without makeup, and there were fierce red lines around her eyelids. She stared at him with wide, wild eyes, dull orbs of dirty marble with tiny blue patches for pupils, and her mouth was a thin slash between gaunt, leathery cheeks. Are you here for the party?" he asked doubtfully. She seemed not to hear him, but continued to stare at or through him. Her mouth made words of a quivering hiss of a voice. "I'm looking for him." "Who?" "The doctor." He decided from her voice that she had laryngitis. "Dr. George's? He'll be here soon, but he'll be busy tonight. Couldn't you consult another physician?" The woman fumbled in her bag and brought out a small parcel to display. "I want to give him this," she hissed. I want to give it to him myself," she interrupted. Two guests that he recognized came through the entrance. He glanced toward them nervously, returned their grins, glanced indecisively back at the haggard woman. "I'll wait," she croaked, turned her back, and marched to the nearest chair, where she perched like a sick crow, eyes glued to the door. John Hanley Slade felt suddenly chilly. He shrugged it off and went to greet the Willinghams, who were the first arrivals. Anne Norris, with her husband in tow, zigzagged her way through a throng of chattering guests toward the hostess, who now occupied a wheelchair near the entrance to the delivery room. They were a few minutes late, but the party had not yet actually begun. "Why don't you go join the father's sweating circle?" Anne called over her shoulder. "The men are all over with John." Norris glanced at the group that had gathered under a cloud of cigar smoke over by the portable bar. John Slade stood at the focus of it and looked persecuted. "Job's counselors," Terry grunted. A hand reached out from a nearby conversation group and caught his arm. "Norris," coughed a gruff voice. He glanced around. "Oh, Chief Franklin. Hello." Anne released his hand and said, "See you later," then wound her way out of sight in the milling herd. Franklin separated himself from the small congregation and glanced down coolly at his district inspector. He was a tall man with shoulders hunched up close to his head, long, spindly legs, a face that was exceedingly wide across the cheekbones but narrow at the jaw. Black eyes gazed from under heavy brows, and his unruly black hair was badly cut. His family tree had a few Cherokee Indians among its branches, Norris had heard, and they were frequently on the warpath. Franklin gulped his drink casually and handed the glass to a passing attendant. "Thought you'd be working tonight, Norris," he said. "I got trapped into coming, Chief," he replied amiably. "How you doing with the Delmont pickup?" "Nearly finished with record tracing. I took a break today and picked up 9 of them." I wondered why you plaster-painted that right eye." Franklin rolled back his head and laughed loudly toward the ceiling. "Newt's mama tossed the crockery at you, did she?" "Her husband," he corrected a little stiffly. "Well, get them in a hurry, Norris. If the Newt's owner knows it's a deviant, he might hear we're after something and hide it somewhere. I want them rounded up quickly." "Expect to find the one?" Franklin nodded grimly. "It's somewhere in this part of the country, or was. It narrows down to about 6 or 8 districts. Yours has a good chance of being it. If I had my way, we'd destroy every Bermuda K-99 that came out during that period. That way we'd be sure, in case Delmont faked more than one." "Be pretty tough on dames like Mary," Norris reminded him, glancing toward Mrs. Slade. Yeah. 500 Rachels blubbering for their children, and all on my neck. I'd almost rather let the deviant get away than have to put up with the screaming mommies." "The burdens of office, Chief. Bear up under the brickbats. Herod did." Franklin glowered at him suspiciously, noticing Norris's bland expression, and muttered, and glanced around the room. "Who's presiding over the whelping tonight?" Norris asked. "Local doctor. George's. You ought to know him." Terry's eyebrows went up. He nodded. "He's already here. Saw him come in the doctor's entrance a few minutes ago. He's probably getting ready. Well, Norris, if you'll excuse me." Norris wandered toward the bar. He had been to several pseudo-parties before. There was nothing to it, really. After the guests had gathered, the medics rolled the mother into delivery, and everyone paced restlessly and talked in hushed voices while she reenacted the age-old drama of birth, in a way that was only mildly uncomfortable and did nothing to aggravate the population problem. Then, when they rolled her out again, fatigued and emotionally spent, the nurse brought out a newly purchased Neutroid, only a few days out of the incubator, and presented it to the mother. When the oohs and ahs were finished, the mother went home with her child to rest, and the father whooped it up with the guests. Norris hoped to get away early. He had things to do before dawn. "Who's that hag by the door?" a guest grunted in his ear. Norris glanced incuriously at the thin-lipped woman who sat stiffly with her hands in her lap, not gazing at the guests, but looking through and beyond them. He shook his head and moved on to shake hands with his host. "Glad you came, Norris," Slade said with a grin, then leaned closer. "Your presence could be embarrassing at a time like this, though." "How's that?" "You should have brought your net and snare pole, Norris," said a man at Slade's elbow. "Then, when they bring the baby out, go charging across the room, yelling, 'That's it, that's the one I'm after.'" The men laughed heartily. Norris grinned weakly and started away. "Hey, Slade," a voice called. "They're coming after Mary." Norris stood aside to let John hurry toward his wife. Most of the crowd stopped milling about to watch Dr. George's, a nurse, and an attendant coming from a rear door to take charge of Mary. "Stop! Stop right there!" The voice came from near the front entrance. It was a choked and hoarse gasp of sound, not loud, but somehow penetrating enough to command the room. Norris glanced aside during the sudden lull to see the thin-lipped woman threading her way through the crowd, and the crowd folded back to clear away. The farther she walked, the quieter the room became, and Norris suddenly realized that somehow the center of the room was almost clear of people so that he could see Mary and John and the medics standing near the delivery room. They had turned to stare at the intruder. George's mouth fell open slightly. He spoke in a low voice, but the room was suddenly silent enough so that Norris could hear. "Why, Sarah, what are you doing here?" The woman stopped 6 feet away from him. She pulled out a small parcel and reached it toward him. "This is for you," she croaked. When Georges did not advance to take it, she threw it at his feet. "Open it," she commanded. Norris expected him to snort and tell the attendants to toss the nutty old dame out. Instead, he stooped very slowly, keeping his eyes on the woman, and picked up the bundle. "Unwrap it," she hissed when he paused. His hands fumbled with it, but his eyes never left her face. The package came open. Georges glanced down. He dropped it quickly to the floor. An amputated, chubby mouth gaping, he stared at the gaunt woman. "My Primrose had a black cowlick in her tail." The doctor swallowed and continued to stare. "Where is my Primrose?" The woman had her hand in her purse. The doctor retreated a step. "Where is my baby?" "Really, Sarah, there was nothing to do but—" Her hand brought a heavy automatic out of the purse. It wavered and moved uncertainly, too weighty for her scrawny wrist and arm. The room was suddenly a scramble and a babble. "You killed my baby!" "The first shot ricocheted from the ceiling and shattered a window," said the television announcer. "The second shot went into the wall. The third shot struck Dr. Georges in the back of the head as he ran toward the delivery room door. He died instantly. Mrs. Glubbis fled from the room before any of the guests could stop her, and a dragnet is now combing." Norris shuddered and looked away from the television screen that revealed the present state of the reception room where they had been not more than 2 hours ago. He turned off the set, nervously lit a cigarette, and glanced at Anne, who sat staring at nothing at the other end of the sofa. "How do you feel?" he murmured. She looked at him dumbly, shook her head. Norris got up, paced to the magazine rack, thumbed idly through its contents, glanced back at her nervously, walked to the window, stood smoking and staring toward the street for a time, moved to the piano, glanced back at her nervously again, tried to play a few bars of Beethoven's Fifth with one finger, hit a foul note after the opening ta-ta-ta-ta, grunted a curse, banged a crashing discord with his fist, and leaned forward with a sigh to press his forehead against the music rack and close his eyes. "Don't blame yourself, Terry," she said softly. "If I hadn't let him have that impounded newt, it wouldn't have happened." She thought that over briefly. And if my maternal grandfather hadn't lied to his wife back in 2013, I would never have been born. Why not? Because if he'd told her the truth, she'd have up and left him, and Mother wouldn't have been born. Oh. Nevertheless, nothing. She shook herself out of the blue mood. "You come here, Terry Norris." He came, and there was comfort in holding her. She was prepared to blame the world, all right, but he was in the world and a part of it, and so was she. And there was no sharing of guilt, but only the whole weight of it on the shoulders of each of them. He thought of the Delmont case, and the way Franklin talked casually of slaughtering 500 K-99s just to be sure, and how he continued to hate Franklin's guts for no apparent reason. Franklin was not a pleasant fellow, to be sure, but he had done nothing to Norris personally. He wondered if he hated what Franklin represented, but directed the hate at Franklin's person because he, Norris, represented it too. Franklin, however, liked the world as he found it and was glad to help keep it that way. If I think something's wrong with the setup, but keep on being a part of it, then the wrongness is not part mine, he thought. It's all mine, because I bought it. It's hard to decide, he murmured. What's that, Terry? Whether it's all wrong, dead wrong, or whether it's the best that can be done under the circumstances. Whatever are you talking about? He shook himself and yawned. About going to bed, he grunted. They went to bed at midnight. At 1 o'clock, he became certain she was asleep. He lay in darkness for a time, listening to her even breathing. Then he sat up and eased himself out of bed. There was work to be done. He tiptoed quietly out of the bedroom, carrying his shoes and his trousers. He dressed in the kitchen by the glow of a cigarette ember and stole quietly out into the chilly night. A half-moon hung low in a misty sky, and the wind was sharp out of the north. He walked quietly toward the kennels. There were only 3 empty cages. He needed 27 to accommodate the doubtful K-99s that were to be picked up during the next few days. There was work to be done. He went into the neutroid room and flicked a switch. A few sleepy chatters greeted the light. One at a time, he awoke 24 of the older creatures and carried them to a large, glass-walled compartment. These were the long-time residents. They knew him well, and they came willingly, snuggling sleepily against his chest. He whistled tunelessly while he worked, began carrying them by the tails, 2 in each hand, to speed the chore. When he had gotten them in the glass chamber, he sealed the door and turned on the gas. Then he switched off the lights, locked up for the night again, and walked back toward the house through the crisp grass. The conveyor belt from the chamber to the crematorium would finish the job unaided. Norris felt suddenly ill. He sank down on the back steps and laid his head on his arms across his knees. His eyes burned, but thought of tears made him sicker. When the low chug of the crematorium's igniter coughed quietly from the kennels, he staggered hurriedly away from the steps to retch. She was waiting for him in the bedroom. She sat on the window seat, her small figure silhouetted against the paleness of the moonlit yard. She was staring silently out at the dull red tongue of exhaust gas from the crematorium chimney when he tiptoed down the hall and paused in the doorway. She looked around. Dead silence between them. Then, "Out for a walk, eh, Terry?" A resumption of the dead silence. He backed quietly away without speaking. He went to the parlor and lay down on the couch. After a time, he heard her puttering around in the kitchen and saw a light. A little later, he opened his eyes to see her dark shadow over him, surrounded by an aura of negligee. She sat down on the edge of the couch and offered him a glass. "Drink it. Make your stomach rest easy." "Alcoholic?" "Yeah." He tasted it. Milk, egg yolk, honey, and rum. "No arsenic?" She shook her head. He drank it quickly, lay back with a grunt, took her hand. They were silent for a time. I guess every new wife thinks her husband's flawless for a while," she murmured absently. "Silly how it's such a shock to find out the obvious, that he's not much different from the other bull humans of the tribe." Norris stiffened, rolled his face away from her. After a moment, her hand crept out to touch his cheek. Her fingertips traced a soft line up and along his temple. "It's all right, Terry," she whispered. He kept his face averted. Her fingers stroked for a moment more, as if she were feeling something new and different in the familiar texture of his hair. Then she arose and padded quietly back to the bedroom. Norris lay awake until dawn, knowing that it would never be all right, Terry, nor all right, world, never, as long as the prohibiting, the creating, the killing, the mockery, the falsification of birth, death, and life continued. Dawn inherited the night mist, gathered it into clouds, and made a gloomy gray morning of it. Anne was still asleep when he left for work. He backed out the kennel truck, meaning to get the rest of the Bermuda K-99s as quickly as possible so that he could begin running the normalcy tests and get the whole thing over with. The night's guilt was still with him as he drove away, a sticky dew that refused to depart with morning. Why should he have to kill the things? Why couldn't Franklin arrange for a central slaughterhouse for destroying neutroids that had been deserted, or whose owners could not be located, or that found themselves unclaimed for any other reason? But Franklin would purple at the notion. It was only a routine part of the job. Why shouldn't it be routine? Why were neutroids manufactured anyhow? Obviously, because they were disposable, an important feature which human babies unfortunately lacked. When the market became glutted with humans, the merchandise could not be dumped in the sea.